At 2:17 a.m., the house in Central America was completely silent. Not the peaceful kind of silence, the dangerous kind that comes right before everything breaks. Daniel was asleep on the couch, still wearing his work boots. His phone lay dead beside him. 2 jobs had crushed his body and stolen his awareness. He believed sacrifice was love. He believed providing money was enough. In the bedroom, Elena stood frozen with a half-packed suitcase. Her hands were shaking not from fear, but from exhaustion. Years of loneliness had finally settled into one clear decision. Matteo rubbed his sleepy eyes. "Mom, are we going somewhere?" Elena knelt in front of him and hugged him tightly, breathing in the smell of her child like it might be the last time. Sophia clutched her doll, confused, sensing danger but not understanding it. Elena walked toward the door and stopped. She looked back at Daniel. This was the man she once loved deeply. The man who promised forever. The man who worked endlessly but never listened when she cried at night beside him. She had begged for attention, begged for time, begged to feel seen. Tonight, she stopped begging. The door closed quietly. That single sound didn't wake Daniel, but it destroyed his family. Minutes later, Daniel shifted in his sleep and whispered her name without opening his eyes. By the time he woke up, his children would already be gone, and the consequences of that night would haunt him forever. Morning light slowly entered the house. Daniel woke up later than usual, his body heavy, his head still foggy from exhaustion. For a brief second, everything felt normal. Then he noticed it. The silence. No cartoons playing. No tiny footsteps running across the floor. No laughter. "Elena?" he called out. Nothing. He sat up fast, his heart suddenly racing. The couch felt colder than usual. He walked toward the bedroom. The bed was untouched. Her side was empty. Panic tightened his chest. He rushed into the children's room. Matteo's bed was neatly made. Sophia's pillow lay perfectly still. No toys on the floor. No shoes by the door. That's when he saw it. A folded piece of paper on the kitchen table. His hands trembled as he opened it. "I can't raise our children alone while still married. I'm not taking them away from you. I'm saving them from growing up invisible." Daniel read the words again and again. This wasn't anger. This wasn't hatred. It was pain he had ignored for too long. Memories flooded his mind: missed dinners, unanswered calls, nights when Elena cried quietly while he pretended to sleep. He always thought there would be more time. Now, the house felt like a stranger. Daniel dropped into a chair, staring at the walls, finally understanding the cost of his absence. He had provided money, food, shelter, but never himself. And in that moment, surrounded by silence, Daniel realized something terrifying. He hadn't lost his family in one night. He had been losing them for years. By the time the sun fully rose, Elena and the children were already far from home. The shelter sat at the edge of the city, a quiet building that looked safe from the outside but felt temporary the moment they stepped in. The air smelled of disinfectant and unfamiliar lives. Elena signed papers with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Sophia began to cry the moment they entered the small room. She kept asking for her bed, for her blanket, for home. Matteo stayed silent, sitting on the edge of the mattress with his shoulders tense, watching everything too carefully for a 7-year-old. "Mom," he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper, "did Dad do something bad?" Elena's chest tightened. She sat beside him and pulled both children close, holding them as if her arms were the only thing keeping them together. "No," she said softly, "your dad loves you." That night felt longer than any she had ever known. Every sound in the hallway made Elena tense. Every cough, every footstep reminded her that this place wasn't meant to be permanent. When the lights went out, Sophia cried herself to sleep. Matteo stared at the ceiling, blinking back tears he didn't want his mother to see. "Will Dad find us?" he asked in the darkness. Elena closed her eyes. She wanted to promise him yes. She wanted to believe it herself. But fear sat heavy in her chest, whispering doubts she wasn't ready to face. As the children finally slept, Elena stayed awake, staring at the cracked ceiling, questioning every choice she had made. She hadn't left because she stopped loving Daniel. She left because loving him had started to erase her. And as the city slept, 3 hearts lay awake in a room that didn't feel like home, wondering if breaking a family was the only way to save it. The house had never felt so big. Daniel walked from room to room, listening to his own footsteps echo against the walls. Every sound reminded him of what was missing. The television sat untouched. The kitchen smelled faintly of last night's coffee. Nothing had changed, yet everything was gone. He stopped in the children's room. Mateo's drawings were still taped to the wall. Stick figures of a family holding hands. Sophia's stuffed bear lay on the floor, one eye missing, waiting to be picked up. Daniel bent down and lifted the toy. His hands tightened around it, and suddenly the strength he used at work every day meant nothing. He sat on the floor. For the first time in years, Daniel cried without trying to hide it. Not the quiet tears of frustration, but the heavy kind that come from realizing you failed someone you loved. He replayed memories he had once brushed aside. Elena eating dinner alone. Mateo falling asleep on the couch waiting for him. Sophia calling his name while he rushed out the door. I was doing it for them, he whispered to the empty room. But now, the excuse sounded weak. He had built walls around his heart using responsibility as an excuse. Work had become a hiding place, and while he believed he was protecting his family, he had been slowly disappearing from it. Daniel stood up slowly, his chest tight with regret. This wasn't just about losing Elena. He was losing his children, and the thought of them growing up believing their father chose work over them felt heavier than any job he had ever worked. That night, Daniel slept alone in a house filled with memories, and as the silence wrapped around him, one truth became painfully clear. If he didn't change now, he would lose them forever. Daniel stood in front of the bathroom mirror long after the sun came up. The man staring back at him looked older than 35. Dark circles under his eyes, shoulders slumped from years of carrying weight that wasn't just physical. For the first time, he didn't recognize himself as a provider or a worker. He saw a father who had failed. The house was quiet again, but this time the silence didn't feel empty, it felt accusing. Every corner reminded him of what he stood to lose. Not money, not pride, his children. Daniel turned on the sink and splashed cold water on his face, gripping the edge of the counter as if it could steady him. He remembered Mateo's voice asking if he would read a bedtime story. Sophia's tiny arms reaching for him as he rushed out the door. I'll do it tomorrow, he had always said. Tomorrow never came. That morning, Daniel made his first real decision in years. He called his supervisor and refused overtime. Then another job, and another. Each no felt terrifying but also freeing. That afternoon, he poured every bottle of alcohol in the house down the sink, watching it disappear like the excuses he could no longer afford. Later, he sat on the couch and held a photo of his children. His hands still shook, but this time, not from fear, from determination. I don't know how to fix this, he whispered, but I won't run anymore. This promise wasn't about winning Elena back. It wasn't about court or forgiveness. It was about becoming the kind of father his children would be proud of, whether they ever lived under his roof again or not. And for the first time since they left, Daniel didn't feel helpless. He felt ready to change. Daniel didn't wait another day. As soon as the sun rose, he stepped outside with one purpose burning in his chest: to find his children. He didn't know where Elena had gone. She hadn't left an address, a phone number, or even a hint. All he had was regret and the fear that every hour apart was changing his kids forever. He started with the places he knew: churches, community centers, shelters. At every door, Daniel told the same story. His voice cracked as he described his children, their ages, their smiles, the way his daughter couldn't sleep without her stuffed bear. Some people listened with sympathy, others with doubt. Days turned into weeks. Rain soaked his clothes as he walked through unfamiliar neighborhoods, asking strangers if they had seen a woman with 2 children. His feet ached. His voice grew hoarse, but he didn't stop. At night, Daniel returned to the empty house. Sitting at the kitchen table where the note still lay folded, he read it again and again, not as a wound but as a reminder of what he needed to become. There were moments when hope faded, moments when fear whispered that it was too late, that his children would grow up without remembering his voice, his face, his love. But then he remembered Mateo's laugh, Sophia's tiny hand wrapped around his finger, and that was enough to keep going. One evening, exhausted and soaked from the rain, Daniel sat on the steps of a shelter he had already visited twice. He stared at the door, wondering if he had missed someone. He didn't know it yet, but the search was about to take a turn that would change everything. The letter arrived on a quiet afternoon. Daniel almost ignored it. Bills had piled up on the kitchen counter, unopened and forgotten. But this envelope was different, official, heavy, serious. His name was printed clearly on the front. His hands hesitated before opening it. Inside were words that made his chest tighten. Custody hearing scheduled. For a moment, Daniel couldn't breathe. Elena hadn't just left. She had prepared. Fear rushed through him, fear of judges, of paperwork, of a system he didn't understand. Fear that someone else would decide how much of a father he was allowed to be. He sat down slowly, reading every line again and again. Dates, times, requirements, words. Like evaluation in parenting. History stared back at him like accusations. That night, Daniel barely slept. His mind raced with questions. What would he say? What if the court believed he was unfit? What if his children were already forgetting him? By morning, fear turned into something else. Resolve. Daniel realized something important. This wasn't a punishment, it was a chance. A chance to stand up and admit his mistakes. A chance to fight. Not with anger, but with change. He began making calls. Legal aid, family counselors, parenting programs. For the first time, he asked for help instead of pretending he didn't need it. As he hung up the phone, Daniel looked at the children's photo taped to the fridge. I'm not fighting, Elena, he said quietly. I'm fighting for you. Outside, the city moved on like nothing had happened. But inside that small house, a father had decided he would no longer be absent from court, from responsibility, or from his children's lives. Change didn't happen overnight. Daniel sat in the back row of a small parenting class, his hands folded tightly in his lap. Around him were other parents, some angry, some ashamed, some broken in ways that looked familiar. For the first time, he wasn't the only one admitting he didn't have all the answers. The instructor spoke about patience, presence, and listening. Simple words, but they hit Daniel harder than any lecture at work ever had. He realized how often he had rushed past moments that mattered, believing he would make them up later. There was no later. Between classes, Daniel attended counseling sessions. He talked about exhaustion, about growing up believing that a man's worth was measured by how much he provided, not how much he showed up. He admitted his anger, his silence, his fear of failure. Each confession felt like tearing down a wall he had built brick by brick over years. At home, he practiced. He cooked meals instead of grabbing fast food. He read parenting books at night. He set alarms not for work but for bedtime routines he no longer had. Sometimes the house felt painfully empty. Other times, it felt like a classroom where he was finally learning lessons he should have known all along. There were moments of doubt. Moments when he wondered if any of this would matter, if Elena had already made up her mind, if the court would ever believe in him. But every time doubt crept in, Daniel looked at the calendar on the wall. He crossed off each day, reminding himself that progress wasn't loud. It was quiet. It was uncomfortable. And it was necessary. By the time the court date approached, Daniel wasn't perfect, but he was no longer absent. The courtroom felt colder than Daniel expected. He sat on a wooden bench, his hands clasped tightly together, trying to slow his breathing. Across the room, Elena sat quietly, her face calm but distant. Between them stood an invisible wall built from months of pain, misunderstandings, and missed chances. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. This wasn't like the movies. No shouting, no drama, just quiet decisions that could change lives forever. The judge reviewed documents, asked routine questions, and then looked directly at Daniel. Why should your children spend time with you? The judge asked. Daniel stood slowly. His legs felt weak, but his voice carried honesty. For a long time, he began. I thought being a good father meant working nonstop. I thought if I provided enough, everything else would be forgiven. He paused, swallowing hard. I was wrong. The room stayed silent. I missed dinners, birthdays, bedtime stories. Not because I didn't love my children, but because I didn't know how to stop running. Elena looked down, her eyes filled with emotion she didn't try to hide. Daniel continued, his voice shaking. I'm not here to take my children away from their mother. I'm here because children shouldn't lose a parent just because adults failed to communicate. No one spoke. The judge leaned back, studying Daniel carefully. For a moment, time felt frozen. Daniel returned to his seat, his heart pounding. He didn't know if his words were enough. He didn't know if change could be proven in weeks instead of years. All he knew was this. For the first time in his life, he hadn't hidden behind work or excuses. He had shown up, and now, everything depended on what the judge would decide next. The courtroom remained silent as the judge reviewed the final pages of the file. Daniel's heart pounded so loudly he was sure everyone could hear it. He stared at the floor, afraid that one wrong glance might shatter the fragile hope he was holding onto. Across the room, Elena sat still, her hands folded, her face unreadable. The judge finally spoke. "I have reviewed the evidence, the evaluations, and the testimony." Every word felt heavy. "This case is not about punishment," the judge continued. "It is about the well-being of two children." Daniel held his breath. "Both parents have made mistakes," the judge said, glancing between them. "But I also see effort. I see accountability. And I see a father who is actively working to change." Daniel's chest tightened. "Therefore," the judge said firmly, "the court grants shared custody." For a moment, Daniel didn't understand what he had heard. Then it hit him. He covered his face with his hands as tears spilled through his fingers. His shoulders shook, not from weakness, but from relief. Months of fear, guilt, and self-doubt came crashing out all at once. Elena's eyes filled with tears as well. She hadn't expected this, not because she doubted Daniel's love, but because she hadn't believed change could come so quickly. The judge continued explaining schedules and conditions, but Daniel barely heard a word. All he could think was one thing. He hadn't lost his children. As the session ended, people quietly stood and began to leave. Daniel remained seated for a moment, trying to steady himself. This wasn't a victory over Elena. It was a second chance. And Daniel knew this time he could never afford to waste it. The meeting was scheduled at a small park near the courthouse. Daniel arrived early, sitting on a wooden bench with his hands resting on his knees. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times, but now that it was real, his chest felt tight. He didn't know how the children would react. He didn't know if they would be angry, shy, or distant. Then he saw them. Matteo stepped out first, holding Elena's hand. He looked taller, somehow more serious. Sophia followed closely, clutching her stuffed bear, the same one Daniel had picked up from the bedroom floor weeks earlier. Daniel stood slowly, afraid to rush. Matteo froze when he recognized him. For a second, time stopped. Then Matteo let go of his mother's hand and ran. "Dad!" The sound of his son's voice broke something inside Daniel. He dropped to his knees just in time to catch Matteo as the boy threw his arms around his neck. Daniel held him tightly, breathing in the familiar smell of his hair, afraid that if he let go, the moment would disappear. Sophia watched from a distance, unsure. Daniel opened his arms without a word. She took a small step forward, then another. "Daddy?" she whispered. "Yes, baby," Daniel said, his voice breaking. She ran into his arms, pressing her face against his chest. Daniel closed his eyes, tears streaming freely now. Around them, the park continued as normal, people walking dogs, children laughing, but for Daniel, the world had narrowed to this one moment. This wasn't about custody papers or schedules. It was about presence. And as he held his children, Daniel understood something deeply. Love doesn't disappear when families break. It waits quietly until someone is brave enough to show up again. Months passed. The house no longer felt empty. It wasn't the same as before, nothing ever is after something breaks, but it was warmer, more honest, quieter in the right ways. Daniel learned how to be present. Not perfect, present. He showed up for school meetings, read bedtime stories, sat on the floor and listened, even when he was tired. Especially when he was tired. The work was still there, but it no longer came first. Elena watched the change carefully. She didn't rush forgiveness. Trust, she knew, takes time. But she noticed the difference not in words, but in actions. Matteo laughed more. Sophia slept better. And slowly, the pain that once filled the space between their parents softened. This story wasn't about a man who lost his family. It was about a man who almost did. Families don't fall apart overnight. They break in quiet moments, missed conversations, ignored feelings, promises pushed to later, and by the time someone notices, the damage feels impossible to undo. But this family proved something important. Change is still possible when it comes before it's too late. Love isn't measured by how much you provide. It's measured by how often you show up, by listening, by staying, by choosing family even when it's hard. And for Daniel, That lesson became a promise he carried every single day. Never sleep through the moments that matters most.